Hello, my name is Deborah Lee Luskin, and I am the author of Reviving Artemis, The Making of a Huntress. And this is a memoir. And welcome to the Springfield Library, and thank you to Tracy Kraft for organizing this, and for Village Square Books for being here to sell books. And for you, online and here, for being here. So what I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about myself and about the book and writing it. I'll read you a little bit, then I'll answer questions, and then I'll sign books. So if anyone buys one. So I was raised in the suburbs of New York City. I was born in 1956. I will be 70 years old on Saturday. And no one in my family, since before Moses, was a hunter. I don't know that for sure, but I'm pretty sure. My father was a World War II veteran. He served in the infantry in Europe, and I found out very late in life that he also had a medal for marksmanship. But we had no guns growing up. I had never held a firearm. And I had never intended to become a hunter. I moved to Vermont in 1984 I wanted to have a garden. And then that grew into raising a pig and planting an orchard, and now I have a greenhouse, and I grow a lot of food. We raise our own chickens. We don't raise pork anymore because we don't eat enough, but we do raise our own chickens, and we slaughter them ourselves. And I have been a hiker. I love being outdoors, and I love hiking, but I have a lifetime fear of getting lost in the woods. I'm married to a man who was born and raised in New Hampshire, who has no fear whatsoever of just walking into the woods. And I would follow him, and he'd say, well, you see, there's the rise over there, and then there's a dip, and there's a ridge, and I just like, you say so, right? And if he would get out of my sight, I could feel myself getting nervous the way I would get nervous in algebra, kind of thrumming in my ears, sweaty palms, can't really focus, just really scared. And I forgot to tell you, I have 3 brothers and no sisters. And this actually plays a lot into this story. So that's through the background. I haven't gotten to the big part, was that when I turned 60, 10 years ago, I hiked the long trail with a girlfriend. We did it in 25 days. And what I learned, one of the things I learned from walking along the ridge, is that there are a lot of trees in Vermont. There are not very many. I mean, if we live in a village and we'll drive on a road, all the habitation is along the roads and in the villages and the towns. But most of the state is just wild. And I came home from that, and I was in my garden, and I looked over the fence, and I thought, I could learn how to navigate, how to read the landscape from the deer. And I knew to do that, I would become a deer hunter. I'd been around deer hunters since I moved to Vermont. And I'd actually gone out with a friend, a woman who grew up in, I think she grew up in Massachusetts, but she was a deer hunter. I went out with my camera, and she had her rifle, and we were out before dawn on opening day. And after a few hours, she kept saying, oh, the bucks will be coming back here to bed down any minute. They could be just on the other side of that hemlock. And I didn't know any better, so I sat there and got colder and colder and colder. And there was this red squirrel there all morning shelling pine cones. And finally, I heard it say, "You're a farmer, go home." And I said, "Helen, I'm leaving. This is not for me." But 30 years later, it was. And I had wonderful mentors, and I learned firearm safety and how to shoot a rifle, which I'd never done. And I went to something called Doe Camp, which is an organization to promote women in the outdoors. And actually, I went on assignment because I am really a writer. I'm a writer in a hunter's clothing. I'm first and foremost a writer and an educator who I worked for the Vermont Humanities Council for almost 40 years. I've been here. I had a wonderful time here using children's books, picture books, to teach new adult readers. And I had a family of four adult brothers. And it was just so much fun. It was great. That's what I have that so connected to Springfield. And so this editor called me up and said, "Do you want to go to Doe Camp?" And of course, I'd never heard of Doe Camp. And I said, "Well, can I take the classes in firearms, marksmanship, and deer hunting, and critter calling for hunters and photographers?" And he said, "That's not really our audience." And I just didn't say anything, because if I couldn't do that, I wasn't going to go. And he said, "Okay." So he sent me off to Doe Camp, and that started it all. And so the first class was 3 hours on introduction to deer hunting, and it was all women, and I learned all the basics. That was great. The next morning was marksmanship, and I thought, if I can't hit the target, this could end it. And part of me was hoping that I'd miss the target. But I've been practicing yoga for a long time. And it turns out I'm a really good markswoman. Very good shot. And so I followed through. And it took me, I was ready by the fall of 2016. I was going out into the field with a rifle that I owned that was small enough that didn't recoil on my shoulder. And I went out into the woods by myself in the dark. I know, I thought. And that's another whole story. So this is the story about learning to hunt. Or that's what it started out as. I started writing the book. I started taking notes during those first few seasons, the first 4 seasons, just to be truthful. I called the book, the manuscript, Learning to Hunt. And every year I added a little bit to it, took notes. And then, this is a spoiler alert, year 4, I got my first buck. And that's where this book ends. But then I started writing the book, and that's when the pandemic hit, which was, I'm sorry to say, a good thing for a writer. No distractions. I didn't even buy groceries anymore because my husband is a physician, and I didn't want to give him COVID. I knew that if he got it, I would get it, and that was okay. But I decided I wasn't going to take him out of commission when he was needed most. So he started doing all the grocery shopping, and he loves it so much, he continues to do all the grocery shopping. It's just terrific. I'll cook whatever he brings home. That's the deal. And So I was writing the book, and that took a few years and many, many drafts, because one of the things, I'd never written a memoir before, and it's different. I've written novels, and I've written a lot of magazine articles and a lot of editorials. You may have heard me. I used to be on what was then called Vermont Public Radio, but I left in 2018. So what I learned is I wasn't just telling this story forward about learning how to hunt a deer. I was also going backwards into my own history about how was it that I became scared of the woods, of getting lost? How was it I had never held a firearm with 3 brothers? How was it none of them own a gun? I'm the only one in the family with a firearm in the house. How is it I became, even before I started hunting, how is it I became so interested in growing my own food, raising my own pork and poultry? I used to keep bees. For 25 years I kept bees, and I stopped when it started to look like I was keeping bears. So I stopped. The only way I could be safe was to stop. And that, I miss my bees so much. I have one more jar of honey left from 2012. And I don't know if I'll ever use it. I would love to have bees again. So I kept going backwards, and that retrospective was hard to examine my own life like that. And in the process of that, I don't know exactly when Artemis walked into my life, but I learned, but she did. And I learned that women have been hunting since before Zeus, right? There are so many prehistoric and early goddesses in many, many cultures who were goddesses of the hunt. The Artemis this book is named after is the Artemis of Ephesus. And this was before Artemis became the daughter of Zeus and the sister, the twin of Apollo. There was a time when Artemis of Ephesus had a temple where she was worshipped. That was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And pilgrims came from all over to worship her, and she was known as the Mother Goddess. Well, in one of the great twists of fate, even though I grew up with 3 brothers, I'm married to a man who's one of 3 brothers. I am the mother of 3 daughters. So when I found out that Artemis of Ephesus was the goddess of women, childbirth, and wild nature, I thought, I've got to learn more about Artemis. And so I went and rewrote that. That was about 19 drafts before I met Artemis. There may be 6 more drafts after that. So it took a while. It took about 3 years to get the book in this format. And then, of course, it took a long time to find a publisher. And then it took a year, took a little over a year to find a publisher. And then from the time I signed with the publisher, it took a little bit more than a year until we have this book, which is also available as an electronic book, and soon it will be available on March 3rd. It will come out as a professionally made audiobook with a narrator I got to choose. I think, I haven't heard it yet, but I'm hoping it's good. So that's the story of coming to this book. But some of the story of writing the book, of not writing the book, of becoming a deer hunter was also surprising. I learned about the forest and the connections between the humans, the forest, and the deer. And we all affect each other. There's no simple thing of just let everything alone. Mostly because of humans. Humans have eradicated wolves from Vermont. So there are not a lot of, even though deer are a prey animal, they don't have a lot of predators. Mostly humans and their automobiles are their main predators. There's some coyotes, and they're also the family dogs that get together in packs and will take down deer. But deer are found in all 50 states, not just the lower 48. There are even deer in Hawaii and a huge number of deer in Alaska. Deer are prolific, and the more pressure they have, the more they get squeezed into a small space, ironically, the more they breed. So even though one of the things I learned in 1876, there were no deer in Vermont. Between the time Vermont became the 14th state in 1791 and 1801, in those 10 years, the population more than doubled, the population of non-native peoples, peoples mostly of European descent, doubled. And in 75 years, the deer were wiped out by the colonials. They weren't ever colonials because we were never a colony, but the European settlers who came from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Europe. So how come we have too many deer now? Because there was a group of men in Rutland who imported 17 deer, and the state of Vermont forbid deer hunting until 1903, or maybe 1898. I have to look that up again. There was a long time of no deer, and then there was the first, what do they call it? It was a controlled deer hunt after that, and it has been ever since. So, but people like my main mentor, who's 10 years older than me, who grew up in Vermont and started hunting when he was like 10 or 12, he remembers he remembers huge deer herds that you used to see because there was so much farmland. But the farmland which is what the deer really love. They live in the forest, but they're graze animals. They have huge nutritional needs. They eat 6 to 9% of their body weight every day, and they prefer it to be grass and then acorns and butternut and nuts. But in the winter, and when the pastures have grown up, they eat browse, which are twigs and shrubs and trees. So even though there's much more forest now than there was in 1950, the forests are endangered by the deer, who have a passion for the high-value saplings, the oak, the maple, and the ash. So there are some forests that have been so heavily browsed, there are no replacement trees. And at the same time, there's been a decline in hunters. And this has its own serious problems, because since 1937 and the passage of the Pittman-Robertson Act, hunters have been paying an 11% excise tax on hunting equipment and hunting licenses, which goes back to the states proportionally to the number of licenses they sell, and is earmarked strictly for conservation. Now, if you go into the forest to take photographs of wildlife. You don't have to pay excise tax on your camera. But if you go in to hunt, part of the cost of your hunting equipment and your hunting license goes to conservation. So, and there are some conservationists who really dislike hunters and hunting, but hunters and hunting are generally great conservationists and are also paying for conservation. I didn't know this, but even though I am now a hunter and I've only had interactions with wonderful, helpful hunters, there is this idea that hunters are beer-drinking, trigger-happy louts who go in and trash up the woods. I haven't met one of those yet, and I hope I never do. But there's no question that hunters are not always held in high repute. Vermont seems to be a little bit different, or has been. It has the highest hunting population east of the Mississippi. Once you get west of the Mississippi, it seems as if everyone's a hunter, and they're hunting much bigger animals. But Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine they're big hunting places. But Vermont has the last data I have is that it had a 14% of Vermont population hunts, and 1 in every 4 Vermont males hunts. I don't know if that's still true, because hunting has been in decline until the pandemic, when there's suddenly a resurgence in hunting, but here's the other part, and this really describes me. Well, maybe not. People who grew up in Vermont 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, all hunted. And then the first generation to leave Vermont or to leave the countryside, the farm, and go into the town might return to the country at Thanksgiving and hunt during rifle season. But maybe the next generation didn't. Certainly the generation that's coming up going to organized soccer and organized skiing and playing organized sports or doing clubs every minute of their waking day, because if they have 2 parents, both parents work, and if they have only 1 parent, that parent certainly works. So their family life has changed. Life has changed. But more than 50% of the world's population now lives in urban areas. We are truly outliers in every possible way living in Vermont. Even if you live in Springfield, doesn't qualify as a city. It's a large town. It might be a city in Vermont terms, but so all this history becomes part of the story here. There are too many deer, because in addition to the deer eating the high-value timber, and lumber is the most valuable of our agricultural products at this point in time, economically. There's also our increased population. I've only lived here 40 years, and in that time the population has dramatically increased. It hasn't seen an increase like this since the 1960s. But when I came to Vermont, population was about 450,000, and there's now 650,000 people living in Vermont. That's huge. And every time a new house goes in, and every time a yellow sign goes up, no hunting, or an orange one, hunting by permission only, or just a no trespassing sign, there's more opportunity for deer to eat everything in the forest. So there's less forest, and then we have more roads. The interstate has come. That's good for killing deer. For an animal that's studied as much as deer are studied by the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, there's not really accurate information about how many deer are killed by cars, because the state police collect the data and the carcasses off the interstate. And then local game wardens collect the animals if they get reported. And they're supposed to be reported. Even if you want them for food, you're supposed to get a tag for them. I'm sure there are many that don't get reported. And then there are deer that also get hit and crawl off into the woods. And they're not known about until Green Up Day. On Green Up Day, we found one place where there were 6 skeletons. And we don't know that they were hit by cars or taken by coyotes, but there's definitely one place that's not. It's a graveyard for deer, between a river and a road. So there are a lot of deer taken by cars. And then there are deer that starve. And there are some deer that are preyed upon by other wild animals. Bear will eat fawn, and coyotes will eat, they'll eat whatever they can take down. So that's the story about humans. And now deer are also vectors for diseases that transmit to humans. The deer tick in particular conveys Lyme disease. And there's some evidence that they carry COVID. I don't know exactly where that stands anymore. We have not yet had chronic wasting disease, which is a brain disease, in our deer in Vermont yet. But it's just a matter of time. It's been found in Quebec, and it's in New York State. So it's very bad out west. So that's that. But this book is not an encyclopedia of deer. It's a very personal book about my life, by telling the story about learning to become a hunter. And among all this interesting information about Vermont's deer population, I also learned a lot about being in the woods. So I talk about reading the landscape, and it's just the same as reading a book. And I am a professional reader. And all you have to do, all I have to do is pay attention, be observant, and you can learn to read. I'm going to read to you just one little section from my 4th season, when I had a really spectacular moment. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, so my 4th season, I had been out. I hadn't seen any deer, or even signs of them, until day 11. And I'll read you this section. On day 11, icy fog obscured the morning light, but the forecast was for sun. I arrived on the land at 8 and walked through frozen mist that turned golden as it thawed. Even the fallen leaves shimmered in a kaleidoscope of topaz hues. My plan was to hunt the ridge, but I was stunned by the morning's beauty and sat on the boulder above the ravine where I'd seen the 2 deer the previous day. The cathedral light invited me to wander. I followed a trickle of stream, crossed it, and climbed a rock outcrop. The mist shimmered and glowed until I stepped into the hemlock, where I saw the pink tape flagging the trail ahead. I knew exactly where I was. To my right, the clearing with the stone oak. That was a tree I got to know very well, and I named it. 2 whitetails vanished into the hemlock, probably does. I looked around. In the soft loam at my feet was an unmistakable, brand new scrape. That's a mark a buck will scrape into the ground, and then he'll urinate, so the urine goes across the glands, scent glands in his hind leg into the ditch. And that is deer Tinder or Match.com, Cupid, OkCupid. That's their way of letting the does know I'm here and available, ladies. So I left the trail and walked until I came to another hardwood clearing surrounded by hemlock, and sat on a log that had fallen beside a stump tall enough to hide my silhouette. I stilled myself in the pale sun. Even motionless, I was warm. I kept my eyes trained on the landscape in front of me when hoofbeats approached from behind. 4 does arrived, saw me, and screeched to a halt like in a Roadrunner cartoon. The lead deer, larger than the others, advanced and stamped her forefoot. The 3 others did the same. I didn't crack a smile, but I wanted to grin. The big girl stomped again. So did the other 3, like the kangaroos in Horton Hears a Who, when one after the other echoes, "Me too." I still didn't move. The lead deer doe snorted. So did the others. It took effort not to laugh. The face-off continued. The dominant doe stamped and huffed just 3 or 4 feet from me. The others lost interest and pawed the nearby leaf litter for acorns. The doe snorted once more and ran back up the hill with her followers close behind. I was elated by this face-to-face encounter with charismatic megafauna in the wild. As far as I was concerned, I was done for the day. I felt the way I feel when I finish reading a really good novel, a bit stunned as I leave the imagined world created with words and step back into the ordinary world I live in. Dishes, laundry. But I promised myself I'd hike to the top of the ridge, so I shouldered my day pack and rifle. That was really a remarkable day. So there's more here also about food, about my obsession with local food and lessening my carbon footprint, about what I eat, and having someone say, "Did you learn what the sound a deer makes when you shoot it?" She was really against me. And so, I've learned how to listen and answer questions. And I'll answer yours if you've got any. Any questions? Thank you. Is anybody here a hunter? Anyone here? Is everybody vegetarian?
My husband lived in Louisiana for a year, and so he's passed away now. So this was long ago, and so he went hunting then. But he didn't like the idea of killing animals, but he loved shooting, and so I never, fired a gun until I met him, and we would go to the range and target practice and kind of compete in little competitions from that group that went. It was a huge range, and so they had different activities and things like that, and using different things like black powder and learning different things. So a long time ago, but I don't eat meat. I don't eat meat because I don't want to see animals injured. So to me, it's like I wouldn't want to hunt, but I know there are a lot of people who do, and having food is a main reason, right? Over time, but also it's skills and activity, like being out in the woods, like you're talking about, and like people go hiking, and many people are involved in hiking.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, you tied these things together somehow.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about the food part.
Okay.
In 1975, I was in college, and Ralph Nader came and spoke. He was recruiting people he was establishing the public interest research groups. And he's the first person I ever heard say, oh, the food in the grocery store, the fresh food, the unprocessed food is shrinking to the periphery. And the central aisles are filled with packaged foods, processed and packaged foods that travels 1,500 miles. And this was in 1975. And supermarkets have gotten bigger, and the amount of unprocessed food. You have to remember, even things that you think of as unprocessed, like milk and tofu, are all processed foods that, they are in fact processed. So there's a wonderful book by a Vermonter called The Mindful Carnivore. You probably have it in the library, by Topher Cerulli. And he was a vegan for years, and then his doctors told him that he had health issues, that he needed to eat meat. And so he started with roadkill, because he didn't want to be involved in killing an animal.
Taking a healthy animal.
But he also found out that a friend of his who raises vegetables is in constant conflict with groundhogs, and that even our vegetables have animal heads, as it were, on them. But in time, we have gotten to the point, we've been divorced from seasons. Foods have seasons. And if you live in California, you might be able to eat a homegrown tomato a lot longer than you can eat one homegrown in Vermont. But all those tomatoes we eat in Vermont in December have a very high carbon footprint. And lettuce, it takes more energy to transport the lettuce than it has caloric value. So, and I didn't intend to become a vegetarian in college, but I had a really bad housing number, and I ended up living in the natural foods co-op. So I became a vegetarian, and of course I became an obnoxious vegetarian, tried to get everybody else to be a vegetarian. And then I'm an omnivore now, and I eat lettuce in Vermont, even in February, on occasion. But I try to stick to cabbages and more things that have stored longer, and all the chickens that are in my freezer. Sadly, there hasn't been any venison for a while, but I'm hoping to change that. But partly because the last buck that walked in front of me and stood still and said, "Shoot me," was such a gorgeous animal, I couldn't. It was it's like a fishing story. It wasn't, I think he was an 8-pointer, and the longer ago it was, the bigger his rack becomes. But I'm not interested, I am a sustenance hunter. I'm really only interested in the food in the hide. Because you can't eat the antlers. And in fact, my first year was 6.5 years old, or 6 years old, and my next year was 18 months old, and so much tastier. So I've since become an archer. I'm licensed for archery, and I could take a doe if I could see one, in range. And I'm very curious to know if a doe is even better tasting. But for me, it started out to be about meat, but now November used to be my least favorite month in Vermont because of the declining light. But if you get outside at 5 o'clock in the morning and stay out until noon, you get a lot of sunlight and you see the sun come up. And whether it's science, that I'm actually getting more melatonin, but I don't have that seasonal depression that used to overcome me and kind of make me want to curl up like a hedgehog by the fire and not move until January 6th, when the light is noticeably longer and starts getting longer. So for me, hunting's now about being outside and just watching the world wake up and watching the animals and carrying my rifle, my loaded rifle, and ready to take, for me, I have to be in right relation to the hunt. Every deer I've gotten, I've taken with one bullet so that it dies swiftly. I have since learned there are hunters who will shoot the deer to slow it down and then take a careful shot. That's not me. I won't do that. I haven't done it. I had a deer that didn't drop down right in front of me. He limped off. The bullet went through his shoulder and then his heart, and he limped off. And I didn't find him immediately because I followed the blood trail, and then it stopped. And I looked around and I thought, if I can't find this buck, I'm never going to hunt again. And I had to stand there. The enormity of taking the buck's life was just overwhelming. And I thought it through and I said, okay, I'm going to circle around back to where I was sitting and start over. And I turned and there was the buck where the blood trail stopped. And it was within 20 feet of where you just hid. He was completely camouflaged. I was so relieved, so relieved. So I hold myself, I'm also not hunting. My family doesn't depend on my deer to eat. We've got plenty of chicken in the freezer and more winter squash than we will finish before the winter squash come in again or before they rot, whichever comes first. So we have food to eat. I do shop at a grocery store. I buy processed food for my dog. Maybe I should rethink that. So, dog food, manufactured dog food. So, but eating in our industrial age with our industrial food chain, every choice that you make is an ethical choice. Long before I became a deer hunter, back when the Brattleboro Food Co-op was in this basement of a building, it was a single room in the basement of a building, I remember I had to choose between organic pears that came from Chile or these kind of knobbly Vermont grown apples that, and price aside, I sort of said to my husband, I said, what are we going to do? Are we going to try to, I want to support organic agriculture worldwide, but it's very expensive and in both money and oil. And so it became, okay, I will take Vermont grown food, even if it's not organically grown, as the lesser of two evils. But we have to make choices. I bake my own bread, but my wheat is not grown in Vermont. It's processed in Vermont. I make exceptions. I am not going to live without red wine, olive oil, chocolate, and whiskey. So, although I have American whiskey now. So, there's no purity to it. There's intention, I would say. And we all make different, there are people who, for dietary preference or reason, don't eat gluten, they don't eat bread, they don't eat dairy, or everybody makes a choice. And so some of what the book is about are the choices that I've made.
Mm-hmm.
And people eat very well when they come to my house. So, any other comments or questions or stories? Yeah.
Just probably a loaded question. I don't mean it to be, but in your opinion, with the shrinking hunting population, like for conservation reasons, is there something the state of Vermont should be doing to encourage hunting?
Yes, and they are.
Yeah.
They are. They've started youth hunting weekends when youth they have to have their license, their hunting license, which is hunter safety. I know there's a lot of resistance to state and federal what's called gun control, but to be a licensed hunter, you have to go through a very thorough hunting safety course that is mostly about firearm safety. And so any youth can go out with a licensed mentor, an unarmed licensed mentor, and they can shoot any deer. And that's before the opening season. When I was coming up, I went to a Fish and Wildlife meeting, and I asked, why isn't there one for new adult hunters? And there is now. So, one of the reasons I became an archer, a bow hunter, is so that I could have both a longer season and I could take a doe. In theory, I could take a doe during archery and a buck during, and also this is not exactly to your issue of the hunting fees, but to the overpopulation of deer and fewer hunters is, I believe, I haven't looked at the hunting regs for this year, but I believe that I will be able to use my bow during rifle season, and that I might be able to get a doe permit during rifle season. I have to check this, so don't act upon my words. It's just, I know that the hunting regulations change all the time, and there are what is a legal buck is different depending on which wildlife management unit you're hunting in. And I hunt in two, one on the east side of the West River and one on the west. And on one side, it has to be one antler that's 3 inches long. And on the other side, it has to be 3 points each over an inch. And I have to look every year to remind myself, every morning, where am I hunting? Which buck is it I can take today? So, and the reason I hesitated with the one I ended up having to track briefly is because he was so close to me and his ears were so big, I couldn't see that he was a 6-pointer until he turned his head and looked at me. I can tell you one more story if you want it, about how, so hunting season is timed to what's called the rut, when the bucks and does are mating. And it is in the hunter's favor. So my first buck, I'll tell you about my first 2 bucks. My first buck, I saw, it was actually this bottle here. I was finished for the day and I was thirsty. So I sat down on a log and I raised my water bottle and I looked, and through the trees I could see the silhouette of a deer. So I put this down and I said, and I waited and I saw a second nose and I said, does it have antlers? And it did. And I said something that's a swear. Oh no. And I put my water bottle down and I picked up my rifle. And the doe saw me. So she came to look. Deer are very curious animals. She came to look. She had started this way, but she came back this way. The buck just followed her. He was chasing her. and I shot him as he was running right in front of me, about where you are. Maybe the chair behind you.
Mm-hmm.
So he was not paying attention like she was. She paid attention to me. He was not paying attention because he was just thinking about mating with that pretty young girl. The next one was this boy. I think he had just had his first sexual encounter and was smoking a cigarette. He was stunned. He was not paying attention. He was just standing in front of me.
Oh no.
So it's a good thing. That the rut is a good thing for Hunter. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Thank you for coming. Thank you, Tracy, for organizing this.
Up your book for just a
Oh, this is my copy of the book. Reviving Artemis, The Making of a Huntress. The story of learning how to hunt at 60 and finding my place in the natural world. And I did this when I was 60, and it's part of learning new things out of your comfort zone to keep you young.